And I will put my camera on for the moment because I would like to introduce myself, and I will start this session today. So dear participants, let me welcome you on our last webinar of the Social Innovation Academy series in the frame of Social Eye-Makers project. My name is Boglárka Barkó. I'm a project manager of Social Eye-Makers project at IFKA. And IFKA is one of the Hungarian partners who was responsible for this last piece of webinar series. Our topic today will be social innovation policies, and we are going to have a respected expert from Germany, Dr. Volker Then. You are already seeing on your camera, and he is going to talk about the hybrid business models in social innovation. We hope that all participants can join us until the end of the session, but if not, then you can reach this webinar later as well on the SKYROCKET platform, as we are going to record the whole session. We have about 25-30 minutes for Mr. Then's presentation, and then you will have a chance to ask questions. You can also ask questions anytime in the chat box. And I'm going to share with you the presentation. Just a second. I'm going to stop the video first. I hope you are going to see it. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Is it working?
Yes, I can see it, Boglárka.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so the title of our webinar is "What role can hybrid business models play in the generating social innovation?" And just a few slides you're going to have about the project we are working on. So the Social Innovation Academy is a free training program developed in the frame of Social Eye-Makers project. It is built upon 7 modules: active citizenship, social business, technology and creativity for social innovation, stakeholder engagement, impact assessment, impact finance, and last but not least, social innovation policies. The project organized 7 webinars around these 7 topics, and today is the last webinar of this online training program. So as you can see, there is a website called SKYROCKET platform, if you are not familiar with this already. As part of the Social Eye-Makers project, the partnership created a website called SKYROCKET platform. And the goal of this website is to increase the capacity for social innovation. On the platform, you can collaborate together across Europe in tackling your social problem or in developing your innovative social solution. And about today's webinar, you see on this slide what questions will be answered by Mr. Then. So what is the role of the hybrid business model? How does the model relate to social innovation and the policy level, and what concrete examples and business models can be used to understand hybrid operation? So our expert today is Mr. Volker Then, and he's the Managing Director of the Center for Social Investment at Heidelberg University, and he has been researching this topic for several years. And Mr. Then, the floor is yours then.
Well, thank you, Boglárka, for your kind introduction and also for inviting me to this last webinar in the Social Eye-Makers project. It's my pleasure to contribute, and welcome to all participants online. When I was invited to speak in this webinar and to introduce our conversation, I started reflecting from a very basic sort of idea of what we mean when we speak of social entrepreneurship. And many of the categories that I will be touching on in my short introduction have already been mentioned in your introductory words. When we speak about social entrepreneurship, I think we on the one hand, have conversations about making business models productive for social contexts. That's one part of the definition. One part of the understanding of social entrepreneurship is the element of business model, but the other part is the element of social innovation. And could we have the next slide, please?
Yes, hold on, I'm trying. Yes. Yeah.
And therefore, I would like to introduce today's conversation by outlining the three arguments that I would like to share with you. The first is that when we speak of social enterprises, we generally speak of a combination of a social innovation approach and a business model. And this by implication means a social enterprise is more than just a business for a social purpose. And secondly, we will find that social enterprise business models are very often hybrid business models. I will explain in more detail what we mean by this category, but it has a lot to do with where do the resources come from to actually sustain the social enterprise. And finally, when it comes to social innovation and processes of how social innovation works in society, we will find that civil society plays an important role in this context. And I would then, sort of touching on these three arguments, I would like to raise four questions more specifically. And the next slide. And those four questions are, first of all, what is the social problem that the social enterprise wants to address? Secondly, in more detail, what is the business model and in what environment does this business model function? What kind of regulation, what kind of policy environment, what kind of sector environment? Third, where do the resources come from for the social enterprise? And finally, what is the role of civil society? This is the four questions that more specifically I would like to introduce in this statement, in this introduction to our conversation. And in the next slide, I would like to very briefly introduce the idea. The next one, please.
Yes, I'm sorry, sometimes it doesn't react as I... yeah.
I would like to very briefly introduce our understanding of social innovation. And I'm touching on a quote that the Young Foundation, and we have done a lot of joint research with European colleagues on social innovation in the context of European 7th Framework projects. One of the early projects of this was the TEPSI project, in which we looked into the basic definition and conceptual issues of social innovation. And we finally agreed that this wording that you find here in the presentation is a good definition of social innovations. Social innovations are new solutions that simultaneously meet a social need, or at least meet it more effectively than existing solutions, and lead to new or improved capabilities and relationships, and a better use of assets and resources. In other words, social innovations are both good for society and they enhance society's capacity to act. So in very brief, social innovations are new solutions to social problems. And to give examples of that, we can talk about product types of new solutions, like using or reinvigorating traditional craft or food processing products and using this as a vehicle of creating employment or creating training opportunities or creating integration for people with disabilities or for people with disadvantages in their life. But we could also speak about the role of electronic devices in assisting old age people in need of help. This would be product levels. When we speak of services, we could think about an inclusive restaurant where people with disabilities or people with challenges are being employed, or we could think about multi-generation co-housing projects which support old age people in the neighborhood. So there are very different ways of organizing innovative services. And finally, innovation can be on the model how a problem is approached. It can be an inclusive teaching program that is an innovation in the way we do education. Or it can mean that we are using a cooperative as the organization for renewable energy production. Or it can mean that we have self-help groups that are actually at the same time supporting each other and producing something. So we can speak, when we speak about the innovation, we can speak about products, we can speak about services, but we can also speak about the way that the production is being organized. A first introduction. I would just like to emphasize a second aspect of social innovation on the next slide. Including the next pieces. I think you may have to click. Yes. Mm-hmm. And I would just like to emphasize the right-hand side of this slide. When we look at what is the role of social innovation in society, we find that there are three very clear criteria that are important. It is about a need. A social innovation addresses a social problem, and social problems is not everything that we find desirable, but it is something for which there is a need in society. There is a clear group of people who have that need, and the need is urgent. Like we may all find it a good need to have vacation apartments on the sea at the ocean, but this is definitely not a social problem because there is no urgency that providing it or not providing it is a task that the whole of society should take care of. So the combination of need and urgency is complemented by legitimacy, and legitimacy means, do we speak about a social problem that as a society as a whole we should take care of? Like the integration of disadvantaged people, or the inclusion of people with disabilities, or the care for people in old age when we have a situation of demographic change and an increasing group of old age people. So it is need, urgency, and legitimacy that really characterizes the innovations that we should call social innovations. So why do I mention all this? I mention it because social innovation is a basic characteristic of social entrepreneurship. The services, the products provided have this character of a social innovation, of something that was not provided in the same way or in the same level of effectiveness in society before. Let me move on to the next step and look at the other side of social entrepreneurship, and that's the business model side. Business model at the first moment seems to suggest that we speak about a market model. We speak about open competition in the market, and that our business model is based on selling something to clients, to private clients, citizens in the market. However, when we look at social enterprises and their business models in more detail, we see that this produces a challenge. When we sell our products and services to clients in the market, this will obviously depend on, can the clients really pay for the service? Will there be enough purchasing power? Will the clients have enough money to buy? And very often this is not the case. Think of processes in education, think of the different services of social support, think of processes in the integration of disadvantaged people. Very often it is not just the clients that can pay for the services or the support they need. Instead, there needs to be a third party coming in. There needs to be an additional funder coming in to pay for at least part of the price. And this can mean that in the early stages, the solution requires some support by grants. It can mean that crowdfunding plays a role. It can mean that in the end, the state plays a role. So when it comes to some of the major social problems, be it care in old age, be it support for disabled people, be it the support for other vulnerable groups, we find that the clients may not always be able to pay, and that therefore we have a triangle. We call it the welfare triangle. We have an additional third party contributing resources to make the business model work. And depending on the welfare state regulations in each country, it may be the state or it may be local government that actually plays a role in this welfare triangle by contributing resources or by regulating the market, by providing citizens with entitlements or by organizing public systems. So you see that this situation, clients cannot just pay for the services they need, is called in economic categories market failure. And there are different ways of addressing market failure. One way of addressing it is organizing resources from an additional third party. And let me say, of course, we can also remain in competitive markets without the third party, but then the services can only be provided to the more wealthy. Then it is not a social solution, then it is a solution to those in society who can pay. And this means, next step, that very often when we analyze social enterprises, we find that they have very mixed financing models. They have revenue from clients and services, but they also may receive donations, they may include some volunteering in their work, they may enjoy some public support, for instance, from local government or even from state or federal government. So that actually they have a very mixed financing model. And they also, in a lot of cases, they include the clients to some extent in the production of the solution. The clients, the people who actually have the social problem and for whom the solution is being needed are involved in the production process. And this also means that non-monetary resources are very important, that social connections, that networks, that issues of recognition are very important. And all this combined, in very brief terms, we call a hybrid business model. So in conclusion, I would say that social enterprises have business models that are not just business for a social purpose. They are organized in a different way and they are sustained. Their financial resource base is different from normal market business. And let me emphasize, when it comes to this distinction, if you only stay on the private side, if a social enterprise only lives from revenue and resources of clients, there is a risk of what we call cherry picking. Cherry picking means we are serving the rich, but we're not solving the social problem. And so in order to really make a social enterprise sustainable, innovation is not only a need for the product or for the service, it is very often also referring to the way that the business itself is financed and organized. This is why we speak about social innovation in this context such a lot. Final argument, next slide. What is the resources that social enterprises can use? And very frequently we think that it is resources of a financial background. A social enterprise needs revenue, it needs financial resources. And in this picture, these economic resources would be the bottom left corner of the square. But I use this picture to invite you to also think about the other corners of the square. There may also be the social capital, the networks, the connections, the trust relationships in a community that are important for a social enterprise. There may be the values that people share, the cultural function on the right-hand side, top right, that is important. And in frequent cases, there may be the political function of a social enterprise, pointing to a need, pointing to a social problem by addressing it and by trying to identify a practical solution. So what I'm saying in this picture is social enterprises live on far more resources than just money. They integrate the different resources. They may actually also draw heavily on social capital, on volunteers, on networks in the community that help produce the service or that help support the concept. And you now see in the center of this picture that I have put this triangle that we typically call the sector triangle in here, which says we have the market sectors, the state sectors, and the private life of families and communities. And the very interesting part of the picture is the center of it. We have organizations that are non-profit organizations because they provide services or products that market for-profits cannot do. We have non-governmental organizations that are exercising roles of political advocacy, of pointing at problems, of raising issues. And we have the informal networks on a local level in local communities among local people. And I would suggest that when we speak of civil society, we speak of all these types of organizations, and they typically mix the resources that we have in the square. They mix not just money to produce something like a non-profit, or they just combine people to advocate for something like NGOs. Every organization, also a social enterprise, works in this mix of the picture. It draws on local networks. It does, of course, have an economic function and it produces services in the market. But it also has a role in the policy environment of solving social problems. This is why we have, in many cases, support from public organizations, from government or from local government, or this is why we have regulations of markets. Let me just use as a prominent example that is not in social services, the renewable energy discussion. If an enterprise wants, for instance, to work with solar energy or with wind energy or other types of renewable energy, it needs a regulation that provides access to the electricity grid, and it needs a regulation that regulates how the prices are settled. And both are issues that are requiring a role of the state, that are requiring a regulation to make these social enterprises feasible and to make this market possible. And let me then, in the next step, combine the two sides of the picture. How do we think about the social problem? I would argue that social problems are first becoming urgent and are becoming visible, the next step, in the local community. The next slide. Again, we see, and this is why I would argue the prompt starts from the local community. Local people or people in the communities feel the need. They realize the urgency of a problem and they start reflecting on a solution. And when they start reflecting on a solution and thinking, they basically begin to debate it locally. There may be entrepreneurs who start creating an organization, and then the concept travels. And if we move on, the question is, the concept travels means the first enterprise may be created and it may be shown in practice that this new solution works. That, for instance, running a restaurant like Dialogue in the Dark does it in total darkness and employing blind people as the waiters and service staff, that such a concept works. So you need to show it and you create the first part of the first social enterprise organization. But in terms of sustaining it, in terms of making this kind of enterprises feasible for long term, you basically have to have two options. Of course, you need the market, the next one. And you also need the state. And it means you have two ways of strengthening the business model. Of course, you need clients, and for these clients, you need investors to produce the enterprise, so you need the market side of the picture. But you may also need regulation, you may need support in terms of the frameworks, which is the policy side of it. And this is why I argue social innovation needs civil society. You have seen in this illustration that we travel in the picture from the real world of local citizens to the large world of the big sectors. And this travel, what I call the travel, or the way from the prototype and the first solution to a sustainable solution of a social problem, this requires civil society. In order to mobilize investors, in order to mobilize clients for a new approach, you need to have public conversations. You need to reach out to a lot of people. You need to advertise for your social enterprise. And this is civil society with regard to building a new market. But you may also have to call for the support of the public sector. You may have to finally argue for regulation when it comes to the role of social enterprises providing support to a whole social problem. And this is why we have the other arrow. So I would argue that social innovation has the two basic strategies how to get sustained and implemented in society. It is a market strategy and it is a policy, a public policy strategy, a change of the framework by government. But the two of them are connected. Social enterprises have to rely on both. They have to rely on their market strategies, but they also have to make a case for bringing public support or bringing the concern and the regulation of government in. And this is why I would argue that the development of social innovation cannot happen without civil society being involved, without civil society mobilizing the citizens for support of such innovative solutions to social problems. And we can move on. You see, it can travel different ways. A social innovation can travel the more economic side, the more political side, or it can even operate in cooperation of the sectors, which I would ultimately argue is the most effective way. The most effective way, I argue, because our European comparative social innovation research has shown that is the combination of all sectors that really makes good solutions reach out to more or less the whole of society. A final word in the next slide or two on hybridity. Hybridity also means a hybrid organization combines the logics and elements of a for-profit business with a non-profit organization. When an organization on the one hand lives on revenue from clients, but on the other hand involves volunteers or involves the networks of local supporters, this is actually combining for-profit and non-profit. And this is in real world what we call a hybrid organization. And in the next and final slide, I would like to remind you that it's not the whole organization that is either more on the non-profit or more on the for-profit side, but it depends on the different functions within the organization. For instance, if a social enterprise, in terms of where do the resources come from, is more on the non-profit side. So it includes in the early stage donations, it includes support from friends and family, it includes volunteer support. Its resources come more from a non-profit side. But it may nevertheless try to sell a very good product. And then the product quality would be more on the for-profit side. It would mean that the enterprise is trying to be very competitive. This is what the black bars in this graph try to show. So you can position yourself when it comes to how are you financed, where do your resources come from, as more of a non-profit organization. Your culture may be very participatory. You may involve a lot of people. And this is more like the characteristics of a non-profit organization. But on the other hand, you may try to sell a good quality product. You may try to do efficient purchasing at good prices. And this would be more for-profit approaches. So you see, hybridity is not just a category of social scientists analyzing social enterprises, but it is a category of very real description of how social enterprises really work when you look at their details. And I would like to summarize again my remarks by reminding you of the fact that I have sort of made 3 steps. I have initially suggested that social enterprises are based on social innovation and on business. I have looked at business models and have suggested that business models are very often not just market, but they are market and something else. And we then tend to call this a hybrid business model. And then the 3rd step, I looked at where do the resources come from and how do social enterprises get sustained and stronger. And I suggested that civil society plays a strong role in providing the resources and in supporting social enterprises to grow and to get sustained. Thank you, first of all, for listening, and I'm open for any questions or for any discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Then. So we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. So I would like to ask participants to ask anything related to this presentation. No questions so far. Then I have a question, if it's possible.
Sure.
So my question would be, how effective could be a cooperation between social and business actors based on this model you just explained, and how sustainable it could be?
Well, let me use real examples to make this more practical. If you think of, for instance, this concept of dialogue in the dark. I'm not sure if you know the enterprise. It is a social enterprise that originated from a German entrepreneur but is now working internationally in many countries. And it consists of 2 parts. You have restaurants that serve food in total darkness, and that's like a franchise. The concept is run by other entrepreneurs as well. Or you have exhibitions in total darkness, where you visit an exhibition, and it is an educational experience because it tells you how people who are blind are really experiencing their lives. Now, on the one hand, this is a business, and it charges revenue. It produces revenue by selling services, by selling food, or by charging entrance fees for the exhibition. But on the other hand, it is a social initiative because it depends a lot on local support of people visiting. It depends on actually public subsidies for employing people with disabilities in many countries. When you employ a person who is blind, you are entitled to certain subsidies from government for employment of disabled people. And you are depending on maybe even volunteers for running the exhibitions when it comes to that part of the concept. So I would say this is an example of mixing the different worlds, and it becomes critical in the end when you speak about one piece. Is it a for-profit or a non-profit enterprise? We actually have social enterprises in both forms. We have social enterprises that are for-profit and nevertheless try to reinvest their profit in their growth and in their mission. And we have social enterprises that are non-profit. They have to reinvest their revenues and their profits. If they make any profits, they have to invest them in their mission.
All right, thank you. And I have one last question, if nobody else is in the air. You had a slide where you explained these three approach. The first was a need-based approach. The second one is the urgency criterion and the criterion for legitimacy. My question would be that how would you define urgency criterion? Because I guess that every problem is it could be urgent for a certain group of people.
Yes.
So how could you? Is it possible to define it?
Well, obviously, it depends, as you are saying. It depends on perceptions, and it may differ a lot if you speak of a local level or if we speak of a level of the whole country or the whole society. When we speak, for instance, of the issue of old age support and need for care for old age people, I would describe the urgency in a situation like we have it in Germany or recently in Russia or in China, where demographic change has contributed to a strong increase of the share of old people, and where the share of old people in relationship to young people is rapidly increasing. So we basically have data on the level of the whole of society that suggests that we need a solution for this issue, and that a large number, more and more old people will need some sort of support. And this would be one level of urgency, but it can also be on a local level. If, for instance, we have a big city or metropolitan area, and we have increasing rent and increasingly expensive housing, then it may be a locally felt urgency that people who do not have high income and who have limited resources increasingly find it difficult to pay for their housing or for an apartment. Then there would be a big difference whether it's the whole country or whether it's a local problem. But nevertheless, it would be urgent on the level of the city or on the level of the big city.
Okay, and you would use data, obviously, to as a base.
You use data, but you also use what I would, in the end, this is why it is connected to legitimacy. You also use public opinion and public discourse. If there is more and more of a public debate about an issue, and you could use as a different type of problem, this, like in the whole range of immigration and of migration, you would realize that urgency is not only a matter of data, but it is also a matter of public opinion and how people in society interpret it. And the combination of the two decides whether they think it should be society that should act, or whether it should be left to citizens themselves individually to find a solution.
All right, thank you for your answer. It's a very interesting topic. Is there any more questions from the participants?
I think there was a question in the chat.
Okay, let me find it. It's a little bit tricky for me because I'm also sharing my screen, and let me open it. Yes.
I can see it as well.
Okay, it's from Melanie Zitka. Hello, I have a question. After your explanations, I get the impression that every social business uses automatically a hybrid business model. I thought this expression is mostly used for examples where a market-oriented side of the organization finances efforts to implement a social mission on the other side of the organization, with the dangers of a mission drift, for example.
Yes, indeed. I mean, you rightly concluded, Melanie, that we make the argument at CSI that social enterprises are almost always hybrid. Why do we do that? We did a lot of empirical studies. That is, we looked also on a quantitative level into the models of social enterprises and found that about 75% of all social enterprises that we analyzed, and this was more than 250, did actually have hybrid business models. So they did not just live on revenue from their clients or their target group. And from this, we concluded that in very frequent cases, or almost all cases, social enterprises are hybrid. There are some exceptions. For instance, when you have organic farming and you produce organic food, you may actually be able to survive as a social enterprise with this mission just on revenue from your clients buying your food. Or the same could apply for organic textiles. So there are some markets where it works on revenue and on what your clients pay. But in looking at the whole field of social enterprises, we found that the vast majority has mixed models. And then indeed, there is a risk of mission drift to do what you get money for rather than what you think the social problem is. This is more a question of I would say, also a risk that that market players are increasingly finding the social enterprise model attractive. So we also have organizations that would just like to show as a social enterprise or as an environmental enterprise, and in reality their profit interest is dominant. So there is this risk, especially when it comes to funders with very specific strategies or ideas. And it means that you may no longer pay first attention to the need and the urgency in the local community.
So we hope it answered the question. I don't know if Melanie is still here. Okay, thanks for clarifying. All right, thank you very much. I'm sorry that Melanie's microphone doesn't work, but yeah, hopefully we solved the problem. I don't see any more questions in the chat box. Anybody else for the last question? If not, then we have a last slide, if I can put it on. Yes, you are going to see some contacts. So if you're interested in social IMAKers projects, here are a few websites. You can look into it. And as I said at the beginning, we are going to upload this webinar, and you can also find the last 6 webinars on our platforms. So if you're interested, please go and check these websites. And if you have any questions, you are going to find us at info@socialimakers.org. And I would like to thank Mr. Then for his presentation and for the participants to taking the time this afternoon. If there are no more questions, then I will stop the recording now, and I wish you a very nice afternoon for today. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Boglaka, for moderating this and introducing me, and thank you, participants, for joining and for listening. And I'm still available, so if you have final questions, don't be too shy. But otherwise, I wish you successful work, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.